On a lonely stretch of highway east of Bath, Ontario, the land looks ordinary. Low rolling hills, pockets of forest, the occasional farmhouse slouched into the landscape. From the road there is no warning for what lies beyond the access gate, no hint at the radial geometry, the towers, the coils of razor wire that crown the perimeter. Drive past the guard stations, around the hulking gate and through the checkpoint, and the world changes. The air tastes different. Sound behaves differently. Millhaven Institution was conceived to be Canada's last line of containment, a modern answer to a problem the country suddenly could not ignore. To understand Millhaven you must go back to why it was built. In 1971 the Canadian penitentiary system was reeling from the eruption at Kingston Penitentiary, a riot that exposed the brittle assumptions underpinning maximum security custody. Guards and inmates clashed, wings were barricaded, hostages taken. The headlines were not just sensational, they forced policymakers to re-evaluate how the state housed its most dangerous and recalcitrant prisoners. Millhaven's planners promised a different future, a fortress designed to neutralize mass rebellion, to fragment coordination, to make collective violence mechanically improbable. Architecturally, Millhaven rendered control visible. Ranges radiated like spokes off a central control hub, movement funneled through the heart of the facility where a handful of officers could observe and regulate dozens of corridors. Observation towers allowed for an overhead view. Centralized locks eliminated the need for officers to turn keys in crowded spaces. On paper, the design reduced human contact and replaced it with surveillance and engineering. In policy rooms in Ottawa and in correctional workshops, this counted as progress. On paper, however, progress often ignores human history. Millhaven opened its doors in 1971 with a steady drumbeat of transferred inmates, many of them survivors of Kingston, many hardened by previous institutions and grave distrust of authority. It did not take long for the old patterns to reassert themselves under a new roof. The same resentments, the same rituals of control and resistance, moved down the road and simply adapted to the radial spokes. If a prison is an organism, a new building is never a blank slate. It is the same species in a different cage. Reports from Millhaven's early years read like a catalogue of the contradictions that haunt maximum security systems. The modernity of steel and concrete sat beside allegations of brutality, administrative neglect, and routine reliance on segregation. Within months of opening, accusations surfaced of guards assaulting incoming prisoners, men beaten while offloaded from transfer buses, cuffs loosened only after bloodied bodies collapsed. Inquests followed. Trials unfolded in provincial court. Some officers faced charges, in some cases the long arc of institutional memory bent in favor of reinstatement rather than accountability. The public fury that had burned after Kingston cooled, but what remained was a settled message to the incarcerated: the new walls were strict in both construction and practice. Those early months seeded grievances that would grow in ways no blueprint could control. When an institution prioritizes containment above rehabilitation, the psychosocial toxicity accumulates. Men arriving at Millhaven described corridors that felt like motel wings without dignity, narrow cells, artificial light, perpetual locks, the echo of boots that never felt like comfort. Access to meaningful mental health support lagged far behind the need. Food and basic provisions left much to be desired. The small indignities piled into a larger narrative. This place was designed to reduce inmates to numbers, and those numbers fought back in ways large and small. It was in that pressure cooker that the first cracks appeared, small acts of resistance, petty violations, and then, in the summer of 1972, a seizure of opportunity that became the defining scandal of Millhaven's early history. On the night of July 10, 1972, a humid, moonless night, a group of men exploited a weakness in what was supposed to be a foolproof perimeter. A section of chain-link fence near a recreation yard, weakened either by rust, design flaw, or human tampering, yielded. 14 inmates slipped through the gap and vanished into fields that minutes earlier had been only a horizon. The escape was not cinematic in the Hollywood sense. It had no dramatic explosions or elaborate motorized plans. It was the product of observation, timing, and desperation. Some escapees were planners, others were opportunists galvanized by the chance to risk everything for a breath of freedom. They moved like shadows through the yard, through the dim pockets beyond the watchtower sweep, and then into the trees. For a few breathless hours Millhaven's iron certainty became porous. The reaction was predictable and immediate. Sirens screamed, lights stabbed the night sky, towers erupted with activity, and within moments the perimeter was a maze of officers, military personnel, and police checking hedgerows, farm tracks, and woodlots. The manhunt that followed drew together municipal forces, the Ontario Provincial Police, the RCMP, and even troops from the nearby base. For local communities, the news propagated terror: doorways bolted, farm gates secured, children kept indoors. Broadcasts repeated instructions and warnings, and the sense of collective vulnerability widened. If a fortress could be breached, what else in our social architecture might be brittle? Over the subsequent days and weeks, most of the escapees were recaptured. Men were found holed up in barns, sleeping in sheds, faint from hunger on the shoulder of a quiet road. A handful made it farther and lingered under different names until informants and routine police work closed the net. In the end, the manhunt demonstrated what many social scientists had long suspected: escape from a maximum security zone is rarely an act of triumph. It is usually an act of desperation, and the outside world, geography, the elements, public vigilance, favors recapture. But the breach did far greater damage than the number of men who got away for a day or two. It undermined an entire narrative of infallibility. If Millhaven could be penetrated, the idea of the impenetrable fortress was a fantasy. The institutional fallout was swift. Lockdowns extended for months. Segregation wings filled. Privileges evaporated. The administration tightened the screws: more patrols, more searches, strict accounts, and rapid audits of locks and perimeter hardware. Policies became punitive and preemptive. Where once routine had been a tool of order, it mutated into the principal instrument of control: regimented schedules, rigid movement windows, shortened recreation, and the suspension of meaningful programming. Many inmates who had not been involved in the breakout endured months of intensified surveillance and the daily humiliation of suspicion. The machine of containment became visibly harsher, and that harshness produced its own pathology. Segregation, the whole, expanded its role. Once reserved for the most violent or disruptive incidents, isolation became the first and often final disciplinary lever. Men were confined for weeks or months in cells so small they erased sensory cues. Guards recounted behaviors among these men that read like the anatomy of psychological collapse: pacing in tight geometric patterns, auditory distortions, hallucinated whispers, and a slow attrition of identity. Public defenders, advocates, and some members of parliament began to note patterns. Segregation solved logistical problems but exacerbated mental health crises. From the outside, the collapse of Millhaven's aura of control spurred political and bureaucratic questions. How had a facility engineered to prevent mass disturbance been breached? Had the rush to build a modern bastion after Kingston overlooked the human variable central to containment? Reports produced in the years after the escape acknowledged both structural vulnerabilities and procedural lapses. Surveillance blind spots were documented. Staffing shortages were exposed. The readiness of guards transferred from older institutions, some hardened by experience but undertrained for new systems, was questioned. Yet not every answer that public report sought could be translated into immediate reform. Even as Millhaven shored up fences and installed more cameras, the institution's cultural architecture remained stubborn. The very measures intended to prevent coordination, observation towers, centralized locks, technological surveillance, also distanced guards from the day-to-day human cues that had once signaled brewing unrest. In effect, the tools designed to reduce violence also reduced human intuition. Officers moved through mechanized routines, reading monitors and CCTV instead of faces and footfall. That separation produced a different kind of vulnerability: the inability to sense subtle social shifts among the confined population. Another unexpected outcome of Millhaven's transformation was the birth of a broader movement for prisoner rights. The suicide of a segregated inmate in August 1974 catalyzed a wave of protest and awareness. Prisoners' Justice Day emerged from that grief as a commemoration and a public demand: recognition of harm, transparency in discipline, and better mental health care. What began as a local ripple became national. Families, activists, legal advocates, and some politicians began to see that the machinery of containment exacted a social and moral cost beyond the immediate safety calculus. Yet for men inside Millhaven, national debates often felt remote. Daily life was a series of micro-decisions made under the weight of surveillance and routine. Breakfasts passed in the glare of fluorescent lights. Counts punctuated pre-dawn mornings. Movement was a carefully choreographed extraction through the central hub. For many, the hours blurred into monotony and the body learned to measure time by opening and closing metal doors. Work opportunities and rehabilitative programs existed but were limited. Many inmates subsisted on the brittle currency of commissary and the quiet economies of favors and reputation. Power inside the walls took forms both official and unofficial. Officers wielded institutional authority: keys, placements, transfers, access to privileges. Internally, social hierarchies formed along lines of experience, alliances, and the instinctive need for protection. Newly arrived prisoners quickly learned the unspoken rules that governed who sat where in a chow line and who kept silent in a yard. In that social order, violence was not always spontaneous. Often it functioned as communication, punishing perceived transgressions, enforcing norms, and maintaining fragile balances of power. The machinery of control produced its own internal economy of fear and respect. And yet, amid the machine's grinding motions, human moments persisted. The chaplains remembered kindness, a shared newspaper, a teacher who helped someone learn to read, small gestures that did not dismantle the institution but preserved islands of dignity. For some men, faith, art, and education created slivers of autonomy hard to erase. For others, the weight of time, decades defined by counts and lockups, produced institutional personality, flattened affect, hypervigilance, and an erosion of future-oriented thinking. Release for many would not mean freedom from consequences, it meant relearning a world that had changed around them while they counted the days by door openings. By the time the dust settled on the 1972 escape, Millhaven had already changed. The institution did not explode into revolution, nor did it implode under public scrutiny. Instead it hardened, adapting to an identity that celebrated security at the cost of human complexity. The story of Millhaven's early years is not just about a fence peeled back on a humid night, it is about the slow conversion of a place meant to hold people into a machine that, through its very attempts to inoculate against chaos, produced new forms of harm. The walls rose. They were meant to keep others out. They also kept something vital in, and in doing so, revealed the fragile humanity the system had been designed to contain. By the mid-1970s, Millhaven Institution no longer felt like a new prison. The paint had dulled. The metal had taken on the permanent scent of disinfectant and rust. The initial promise of modern corrections had eroded under the daily grind of control, containment, and psychological pressure. What remained was not simply a prison, but a system refined by fear, routine, and the lingering aftershock of the 1972 escape. From the outside, Millhaven appeared calm again. The sirens were gone. The helicopters no longer haunted the tree line. The fields were quiet. But inside the walls, the aftermath of the escape had reshaped everything. The prison had entered its hardened era. Security was no longer reactive. It was absolute. Every day now followed a ritual so rigid it felt ceremonial. Morning count came before dawn, fluorescent lights snapping awake across the ranges. Steel doors rattled as guards moved methodically from cell to cell, verifying bodies, ensuring no one had slipped through the cracks during the night. Prisoners rose with slow, practiced movements. There was no rushing. There was nowhere to run. Time inside Millhaven was no longer measured in weeks or months. It was measured in counts. Breakfast followed under tight escort. Lines were silent. Trays moved across steel counters, hands reached, meals passed. I stayed forward. Conversations were rare and cautious. Even the smallest exchange could be misread as an act of coordination. After the escape, coordination itself had become suspicious. Movement through the prison was centralized and controlled through the radial hub that defined Millhaven's design. Every range, every corridor, funneled through a single observation point. Guards stood above on elevated platforms, watching bodies move like pieces on a control board. This architecture was not accidental. It reduced independence. It replaced intuition with engineering. And it worked, at a cost. Recreation became limited. When it happened under intense surveillance. Yard movements were timed, counted, and terminated without explanation if tensions rose. Some men walked in slow circles under the gaze of towers. Others sat along the edges, motionless. Weightlifting, once a release, became a privilege that could vanish overnight. Segregation expanded. After the escape, isolation became the institution's most trusted instrument. Men were sent as solitary not just for violent acts, but for suspicion. For rumored association. For being viewed as influential. For being unpredictable. The philosophy was simple, it was easier to isolate potential leaders than to deal with another coordinated breach. The segregation unit was a world within the prison, a place where sound behaved differently, where time thickened into something heavy and unmoving. Cells were small. Light was constant. Contact was minimal. A slot in the door delivered meals. Showers were limited. Human voices were rare. For some men, segregation lasted days. For others, it lasted months. Psychologists would later describe the effects with clinical language: sensory deprivation, hallucinations, time distortion, emotional flattening. The men inside used simpler words: losing yourself. One former prisoner later said, "You stop being angry in segregation. You stop being afraid. You stop being anything. That's when you know it's working." Mental health care existed at Millhaven, but equal access did not. The prison had not been built around treatment. It had been built around restraint. Requests for counseling could take weeks. Psychiatric assessments were brief and filtered through security needs. The men most in need of care were often those least likely to be seen. Suicide attempts increased quietly during this period. Some were documented. Others were classified as incidents and buried in reports. In response, the administration reinforced observation, but often without expanding meaningful treatment. As the institution hardened, so did the officers. Correctional staff operated in an environment of permanent vigilance. The escape had taught them one central lesson: assumptions were dangerous. Every interaction with an inmate now carried dual meaning, human and tactical. A friendly gesture could be manipulation. A casual question could be reconnaissance. Many officers were young. Some had transferred from Kingston Penitentiary. Others were fresh to maximum security. Training emphasized control, compliance, and survival. De-escalation existed in theory but not always in practice. The range demanded authority. Showing uncertainty could invite challenge. The emotional toll on officers quietly accumulated. Hypervigilance followed them home. Sleep fractured. Family conversations shortened. Some grew distant. Others hardened. A few broke and left within their first year. Many stayed and absorbed the tension into their bones. Inside the ranges, inmate society reorganized under pressure. Unwritten rules emerged quickly. Where to sit. Who to speak to. When to stay silent. These rules were not formalized, but they were enforced collectively. A man who ignored them risked isolation from his peers, or worse. The prison social code existed because order cannot exist in a vacuum. If the institution did not provide stability, inmate communities would construct their own. Violence inside Millhaven was not constant, but it was precise. It was rarely random. It emerged from disputes over respect, betrayal, debt, or perceived weakness. When it happened swiftly. Afterward came lockdowns, searches, and reprisals. Everyone paid for the actions of a few. That collective punishment further strengthened inmate cohesion. It also deepened resentment toward the administration. Contraband became more valuable than ever. Tobacco, pills, makeshift alcohol, sharpened plastic, hidden notes, anything forbidden acquired power. Not only because it was illegal, but because it restored a fragment of choice. A single cigarette became currency. A hidden blade became insurance. A page torn from a book became a coded message. The institution responded with more searches. Cells were stripped. Mattresses were cut open. Personal property was examined. Mail was delayed. Visits were shortened. Yet contraband continued to surface. The more control tightened, the more ingenuity flourished. Fear became the true currency of Millhaven. Inmates feared segregation, retaliation, and being misunderstood. Guards feared sudden violence, organized defiance, and institutional failure. Fear moved through the prison like electricity, unseen but constant. The men serving life sentences felt that fear differently. For them, time was not a countdown to release. It was a landscape they would never leave. Each year blurred into routines. Some lifers turned inward, building rigid personal schedules around reading, exercise, and spiritual practice. Others embedded themselves deeply into prison politics, becoming power brokers of the internal system. Legacy mattered more than freedom. How you were remembered inside mattered more than how you were seen outside. A man's reputation, fair or violent, reliable or reckless, followed him across ranges and even into transfers. In a place where the future is uncertain or non-existent, memory becomes survival. Family contact became both anchor and wound. Visits happened behind glass. Phone calls were scheduled and monitored. Letters arrived late and left early. Children grew into adults beyond the fence. Parents aged and died with only voices as goodbye. Many inmates learned of deaths days or weeks after they happened. Grief inside Millhaven had nowhere to go. There were no funerals, no embraces, no shared mourning. Men returned to their cells after learning of life-altering loss and sat alone with the weight of it. Some grew quieter. Some grew angrier. Some broke. It was in this emotional vacuum that Prisoners' Justice Day took deeper root. Born from protest and grief, the annual hunger strikes and commemorations spread across institutions. At Millhaven, the administration viewed these acts as security risks. Lockdowns increased around August 10th. Extra patrols were deployed. Intelligence units monitored conversations. To the men inside, the day represented a rare moment of collective recognition, a reminder that their suffering existed beyond the walls. Outside, public memory shifted slowly. Millhaven's name became associated with severity. News coverage referenced it as Canada's most secure institution. It held the men deemed too dangerous, too unpredictable, or too disruptive for anywhere else. Few outside questioned what the designation truly meant for the men inside. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, Millhaven had become what it was never publicly branded as. A place not just of punishment, but of permanent pressure. Yet even under that pressure, humanity persisted. Some inmates learned to read in their 40s. Others learned trades they would never practice outside. Some found faith. Some found art. Drawings filled notebooks. Letters turned into lifelines. These were not acts of rebellion. They were acts of preservation. A man sweeping a corridor slowly wasn't just cleaning. He was controlling the only space he could. A man reading a book for the 5th time wasn't bored. He was building a world he could revisit freely. A guard offering a second slice of bread wasn't lenient. He was recognizing another human being. These gestures mattered because the machine was relentless. By the end of the first decade after the escape, Millhaven had solidified into its long-term identity, a hyper-controlled environment shaped by suspicion, fear of coordination, and the institutional memory of humiliation on that July night in 1972. It was no longer reacting to the escape. It was living in reaction to it. Every policy, every patrol, every locked door carried the imprint of that breach. Trust had been replaced with verification. Flexibility had been replaced with procedure. And beneath it all, the question that no report could fully answer. Was Millhaven preventing chaos, or manufacturing it? For the men inside, the answer was lived, not debated. They woke to it each morning. They slept under it each night. And every breath passed through walls built not just to contain bodies, but to manage something far more volatile. The human will. By the time Millhaven entered its second decade of operation, the prison was no longer defined only by walls, towers, or razor wire. It was defined by memory. Institutions remember. Not in the way people do, but in policy, routine, architecture, and reflex. Every decision inside Millhaven now echoed with the lessons of its early years, the violence inherited from Kingston, the humiliation of the 1972 escape, the suicides, the protests, the lockdowns. These events did not fade into history. They hardened into doctrine. Millhaven did not merely operate on security. It operated on fear of repetition. Every count, every segregation order, every lockdown carried the unspoken logic, never again. The question that loomed over the institution was no longer how to rehabilitate the men inside, but how to ensure they never again embarrassed the fortress. Time inside Millhaven did not pass normally. It accumulated. For inmates serving short sentences, time still moved towards something: release, parole, return. For men serving life or indeterminate sentences, time became territory they would never exit. The calendar became abstract. Years dissolved into cycles of routine. Men measured their lives not by holidays, but by lockdowns, transfers, and parole denials. Long sentences reshape the human mind. Hope becomes dangerous. Too much of it leads to despair when expectations collapse. Too little leads to emotional death. Many men learn to ration hope like medicine, small doses, carefully controlled. They stopped imagining futures too vividly because imagination, in a place like Millhaven, could become a form of torture. Psychologists studying long-term incarceration describe a phenomenon called time compression. After years in confinement, memory collapses. 10 years blur into 2. Trauma distorts sequence. A fight from last week feels as immediate as one from a decade ago. The present becomes thick, the future thin. Men who arrived at Millhaven in their 20s began to age faster than those outside. Stress carved their faces. Posture changed. Eyes dulled. Health deteriorated early. Addiction histories, limited medical care, and permanent anxiety accelerated decline. By the time many reached their 40s, they carried the bodies of men in their 60s. Aging behind bars introduced a new kind of suffering. Men watched themselves weaken without privacy. Grey hair appeared in steel mirrors. Joints stiffened during morning unlock. Chronic pain became routine. Some received medical accommodation. Others were told to adapt. For inmates who once lived by strength, the loss of physical power was destabilizing. A man who could no longer defend himself became vulnerable in ways that had nothing to do with crime. For these men, fear returned, not of punishment, but of helplessness. Mental health inside Millhaven continued to fracture under weight. While psychiatric services expanded slowly through the 1980s and 1990s, they never fully matched demand. Long-term segregation, institutional violence, grief from family deaths, and chronic hypervigilance produced widespread psychological injury. Depression became common. Paranoia became normalized. Some men developed dissociative behaviors, detaching from their own thoughts as a way of reducing pain. The prison system labeled many of these men as disruptive. The men labeled the system as unbearable. One former inmate later said, "After 10 years, you don't know if you react into reality or to what the prison taught your brain was real." Solitary confinement deepened the damage. By the late 20th century, segregation at Millhaven had become embedded as a standard response to instability rather than a last resort. Men were moved in and out of isolation based on behavior, suspicion, and institutional politics. The consequences were predictable. Sensory distortion, emotional collapse, hallucinations, panic attacks, and long-term cognitive impairment appeared again and again in case files. Yet the institution continued to rely on solitary because it worked in one narrow way. It created silence. It did not, however, create healing. For guards, the consequences of the machine were equally profound. Long-serving officers found themselves emotionally disconnected from families, uneasy in civilian spaces, hyper-alert in grocery stores and restaurants. Many unconsciously adopted prison body language in everyday life, backs to walls, eye scanning, hands never fully relaxed. The prison followed them home. Burnout became routine. Some officers grew increasingly authoritarian, leaning into control as armor against fear. Others grew withdrawn. A few attempted to humanize their role wherever possible, quietly offering small mercies within the limits of policy. These officers were respected by many inmates and sometimes resented by their peers. The psychological toll on staff was rarely discussed publicly. Millhaven developed a reputation not just as a hard prison, but as a permanent assignment. Officers transferred in and rarely transferred out. They aged alongside inmates they would supervise for decades. In some cases, guards watched men enter in their 20s and die in their 60s without ever leaving. The boundaries between authority and familiarity blurred. Inside the inmate population, influence shifted generationally. The men who had lived through Kingston and the early Millhaven years became elder figures. They carried institutional memory, the beats of the riots, the terror of the escape, the hunger strikes, the crackdowns. Newer inmates learned through them what the institution expected and what it could do when threatened. These veterans often shaped the social order. Some became stabilizers, counseling younger inmates to avoid mistakes that had destroyed their own chances. Others became hardened enforcers, preserving the codes of the yard with intimidation. In both forms, power inside Millhaven flowed horizontally as much as vertically. Official authority controlled movement. Unofficial authority controlled behavior. Contraband networks never disappeared. Even under cameras, electronic locks, and rigorous searches, forbidden items circulated. Not because staff were universally corrupt, but because total control over human ingenuity is impossible. Every restriction generates new methods. Tobacco traveled through visits and staff pockets. Pills moved through medical wings. Homemade alcohol fermented quietly behind sealed doors. Contraband was not just indulgence. It was power. A man who controlled supply gained protection. A man in debt lost freedom. Entire social hierarchies formed around invisible economies. Every crackdown shattered these markets temporarily and made the next iteration more sophisticated. Fear and adaptation moved in an endless loop. As the decades passed, Millhaven adapted, but it did not soften. Technological surveillance expanded. Electronic door systems replaced manual locks. CCTV became omnipresent. Motion sensors, controlled lighting grids, and communications monitoring tightened institutional reach. The prison learned to see everywhere. Inmates learned to see the prison seeing them. They studied camera sweep cycles. They learned blind spots. They traded intelligence the way others traded currency. The game of observation became mutual. Control no longer flowed in a single direction. Routine became absolute. By the 1990s, a day inside Millhaven looked almost identical to a day 10 years earlier. Count. Meals. Work or sell. Recreation. Lockdown. Repeat. This stability was celebrated administratively as success. The absence of riots, mass escapes, or large-scale uprisings was treated as proof of order. But stability did not mean peace. It meant pressure held in place. Men adapted to the machine's invisible psychological patterns. Some developed emotional numbness, blunted expressions, hollow reactions, and mechanical politeness. Feeling too much had become dangerous. Others turned inward, retreating into books, faith, journaling, or imagination. These men survived by building worlds no guard could search. Some men hardened. They stopped viewing themselves as people and adopted roles: enforcer, negotiator, soldier, predator. These roles provided clarity in a world that blurred identity. Violence became communication. Reputation became armor. And some men broke. They lost the ability to regulate emotion. They became volatile, unpredictable, or withdrawn to the point of disappearance. These men cycled through segregation, hospital units, and disciplinary cells in an endless loop of deterioration. Institutionalization took hold. By the time some men approached release after decades inside, they feared freedom. The outside world had become alien. Traffic overwhelmed them. Doors without locks frightened them. Social choice paralyzed them. Even silence without echo felt threatening. Parole did not always feel like rescue. For some, it felt like exile from the only world that still made sense. Those who returned to prison after brief moments of freedom were often not driven by criminal purpose, but by psychological displacement. The prison had reshaped their sense of normal. Time had become their warden. Outside the walls, public understanding of incarceration shifted slowly. Advocacy groups questioned the ethics of prolonged solitary confinement. Reports exposed patterns of mental health neglect. Families of inmates told stories that contradicted the official narrative of order and control. Millhaven's reputation became complicated, a place of security, yes, but also of deep psychological cost. The institution endured peer reviews, audits, and reform attempts. Some changes followed. Programming increased marginally. Mental health staffing improved gradually. External oversight strengthened. But the core of the machine, the reliance on control through restriction, remained intact. Millhaven did not transform. It adapted. And adaptation is not the same as healing. For many inmates, meaning eventually became internal. When future ground to a halt, purpose had to be generated from within. Some men became mentors, guiding younger inmates away from violence. Others became artists, turning scrap paper into testimony. Some became scholars, earning degrees they would never use outside the walls. A few found transformation. But transformation inside a cage always carries limits. Even a changed man remains confined. This reality created a final psychological paradox for long-term inmates: growth without destination. They evolved morally and intellectually without the promise of reintegration. Their redemption existed only inside the institution that had shaped their worst mistakes. As Millhaven entered the modern era, it carried all of this with it: the escape, the crackdowns, the protests, the dead, the survivors. The prison had become something more than a building. It had become a machine that remembered. It remembered disorder. It remembered humiliation. It remembered fear. And in remembering, it justified itself endlessly. Today, Millhaven stands as both fortress and archive, a place where steel preserves not only bodies, but decades of unresolved tension between punishment and humanity. For the men inside, the legacy is not historical. It is daily. Every lock echoes the past. Every count repeats the lesson. Every night behind the door renews the contract between the state and the confined. And the central question that first haunted Millhaven at its birth still lingers beneath the concrete. Can a system built entirely on control ever truly be secure, if it must constantly reshape the human mind to maintain that control? Millhaven answered that question the only way such a machine can. Not with certainty, but with endurance.